You have decided. You want to see more terrain on this channel and I want a new gaming board. So why not bring both together and start a new crafting series dedicated to recreating one of the greatest worlds in video game history, Elden Rings Lands Between. I think it's safe to say that everyone who gets into miniature games dreams of having the perfect hobby setup. There are so many different directions you can take in achieving this. On one hand, you can simply use a few books, vases or other household items to simulate houses, trees and other terrain pieces. On the other hand, you can create elaborate setups that, in my opinion, elevate your game to a whole new level. This is especially true if you're into more immersion-focused games like Mordheim, Necropolis or Forbidden Psalm. Now, what do all these games have in common? They are all set in a dark fantasy world filled with relentless undead, wretched lords and ladies and, of course, treasures from long-lost times. If you're like me and spend way too much time with video games, this might remind you of a certain title that, especially thanks to its DLC, has cemented its place as one of the most challenging, yet most immersive open worlds ever created. Of course, I am talking about Elden Ring. In this video, I want to focus on the basics, so you might not find the typical Elden Ring specific details here. Those will come later, so if you don't want to miss them, make sure to hit the subscribe button. If you want to see that specific video sooner, you can support me on Patreon. There you also get behind the scenes content and a preview of upcoming topics. The link is down below in the video description. For now, I am focusing on the general landscape and vegetation, specifically the landscape of Limgrave. As a starting area, it's probably the most memorable part, filled with wonder and excitement of things to come. The lush yet slightly autumnal vegetation is interwoven with uneven craggy terrain. You'll also find those literally golden trees that shimmer in the light of the Earth Tree. So how can we recreate that? First off, let's start with the basic construction that will serve as the foundation for all my future tiles. I used these 12 by 12 cm square tiles as a base. On top of that, I glued a 1 cm thick EPS sheet to give the tile a bit of height and to allow for the insertion of magnets in a later step. For adhesion, I used construction adhesive, which has the added benefit of not shrinking while drying. This helps preventing warping later on. Warping is the main reason I chose an MDF underside in the first place. These tiles will be soaked in PVA later, which can cause warping if you lose less resistant materials. However, I must admit that MDF is not as versatile or easy to handle as, for example, EPS. By combining both materials, you simply get the best of both worlds. Approaching the tiles this way also allows you to embed rocks and other bits directly into the surface. When you look at nature, you probably noticed that rock formations are usually embedded in the ground rather than sitting on top of the soil. I don't want to spoil the final result, but I can already tell you that this approach looks much better than simply gluing a piece of bark to the surface and hiding the seams with air drying clay. At this point, I also remembered to add the magnets. It's crucial to be mindful of the correct polarization, as a mistake here can easily mess up your entire tile system. To make things easier, I used magnets with slightly different diameters for a better visual reference. I oriented them so that their top surfaces were magnetically opposed. While applying them, I ensured that the downward-facing surfaces always faced the inside of the tile. Additionally, I made sure that the larger magnets were always on the right side, while the smaller ones were on the other side. I used construction adhesive for a stronger bond, but if you have a low-temperature hot glue gun, that works well too. With the magnets in place, I added small decorative stones, coarse sand and fine grit to the surface. I applied undiluted PVA to the EPS surface and then added the clutter. After removing the excess, I doused the pieces in isopropyl alcohol and used diluted PVA, applied with a pipette, to further strengthen the bond. At this point, the tiles were ready for painting. I primed them in brown and painted the rocks in progressively lighter shades of grey, applying the lightest tones to the most exposed areas. Instead of just dry brushing, I used a much more deliberate technique with a regular paintbrush to enhance the highlights. I remember doing this in my video on the Dungeons & Lasers cave set, and I really liked the results there. Now, if you take a look at the ground texture in Elden Ring, you'll notice it's not just simple brown soil, but much more a varied interplay of different tones and hues. To achieve a similar effect, I used various pigment powders to create a more visually interesting coloration of the soil. I also used these pigments to add more tones to the rocks. And with that, my tiles were finished, at least painting-wise. But wait, there is more. I am talking, of course, about vegetation. This time I plan to use everything in my miniature plant arsenal. Flower tufts, fine turf, static grass, and, for the first time, laser-cut paper plants from Gamer's Grass. Combining all these elements creates a wonderful mishmash of vegetation that I really wanted to feature on my tiles. First, I started with fine turf. I used 3 different tones: dark green, yellow ochre, and a lighter warm green that serves as a great middle tone. I mixed them together in a balanced ratio and used PVA to apply the mixture to the soil and rocks. Next up were the static grass, tufts, and the laser-cut plants, all of which I applied in one go. First, I applied PVA to the areas I wanted to cover, added the red and yellow flower tufts, and then applied the static grass using an applicator. The mix I used was a homemade blend of patchy brown grass, a yellowish summer grass, and a finer green grass that made the bulk of the whole mix. While the PVA was still wet, I added the paper plants by pressing them into the adhesive beneath the grass. I then added a small drop of PVA on top of the joint and covered the area with a second application of static grass. Doing it this way ensures a fully integrated look of these plants, which I really like. With this step complete, I let the tiles fully dry and moved on to another aspect of vegetation. For the trees, I used shrub branches I found at the local craft supply shop. Unfortunately, the vendor couldn't tell me which type of shrub they were from. But after some research, I discovered that branches from a lilac bush closely resemble these. Alternatively, you can use a method I demonstrated in my forest dungeon video from last year, though that approach takes a lot longer. After cleaning the branches, I based them with a mix of PVA and brown paint. This step locks in any lingering dirt and loose bits while providing a basic coat for the trees. Next, I added Iceland moss to create the treetops. Fixing the moss can be a bit tricky, and I wasn't satisfied with my previous attempts using spray adhesive. So I tried a different method. I watered down some PVA with water, submerged the moss pieces in that mixture, and then applied them to the trees. Although this method is admittedly a bit messy, it results in an incredibly sturdy bond once everything is dry. While the trees were drying, I began making some leaves to decorate the treetops. For this, I used a miniature leaf punch. I have one from Green Stuff World, but AK Interactive and other miniature companies offer similar products that work just as well. To use the punch, you of course need some sort of paper to cut your leaves. While you could go outside and find something suitable, I wanted to have full control over the colors and also desired a bit of texture. So I opted for this handmade 140 gram paper that is usually used for wet painting techniques. Though the thickness of the paper is not the main reason for my choice. its texture is. While you can use regular flat paper, I prefer the admittedly somewhat exaggerated look of the textured paper. To reflect the yellowish golden hue of the leaves in the game, I based the paper completely in yellow ochre. Although I used standard acrylic paints for this, I made sure to significantly dilute it. I wanted to ensure that the paper absorbed it well to avoid white cut marks. While that was still drying, I used brown ink through an airbrush to add a bit more tonal variety. After the paper was sufficiently dry, I used the aforementioned leaf punch to cut out the leaves. At this point, the trees were dry as well, so I started painting them. I began with a brown primer, followed by a white coat applied mainly from above. The treetop was painted with yellow ochre. Next, I based the tree trunk with brown and green ink. After that, I dry brushed the trunks with light brown, light green, light blue-green and light yellow-green. And after that, it was just a matter of adding the leaves to the treetops, which I achieved with PVA glue. Once that was dry, I attached the trees to the tiles by drilling fitting holes, filling them with construction adhesive, and covering the seam with another PVA-soaked piece of Iceland moss. And with everything dried and a coat of matte varnish applied, the tiles were ready to be explored. And here they are. I think it's a great start for building a complete table with similar tiles. What do you think? And most importantly, what should I add to this set? Please leave your comments and suggestions down below, and as always, don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. If you want to help me keep the lights on, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Thank you again for watching, and if you like Elden Ring inspired projects, you'll probably enjoy this one as well. I hope to see you in the next video, so until then, farewell, fellow adventurers.